The journey begins. The airport terminal buzzed with activity, a symphony of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and distant conversations, blending with the overhead announcements. 10-year-old Miles Carter clutched his backpack tightly, his fingers curling around the straps as he navigated the chaos with his mother. The moment felt monumental, his first solo flight, a step toward independence, and a chance to honor the memory of his late father, an aviation engineer whose influence had shaped Miles' love for the skies. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" his mother, Serena, asked, her voice a mix of pride and concern. She crouched down to meet his eyes, brushing an unruly curl from his forehead. Her expression softened as she studied his face, so much like his father's, full of curiosity and determination. Miles nodded, his lips curving into a reassuring smile. "I'm ready, Mom. Dad always said the sky is where we find adventure." Serena smiled faintly, her heart aching at the mention of her late husband. "He would be so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have everything you need." Miles patted his backpack. Inside was his most cherished possession, his father's old aviator watch and a journal filled with airplane sketches and notes on aerodynamics. "Got it all," he said confidently. They approached the check-in counter, where a tall woman in a navy blue uniform stood with a clipboard. Her name tag read Elise Hawthorne, senior flight attendant. Her perfectly coiffed hair and pristine appearance exuded professionalism, but her expression was cold and indifferent as she scanned the line of passengers. "Next," she called, her tone clipped. Serena stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Miles' shoulder. "This is my son, Miles," she began, her voice warm but firm. "He's traveling alone today. Here are the forms." Elise glanced at the paperwork briefly, her eyes flicking to Miles with a trace of impatience. "Unaccompanied minor," she muttered, almost to herself. She handed Miles a lanyard with a plastic tag attached, indicating his status. "Wear this around your neck at all times," she instructed curtly. "Yes, ma'am," Miles replied politely, slipping the lanyard over his head. Elise barely acknowledged him. "Follow the rules, stay seated, and don't cause any trouble," she added without looking up. To her, he was just another task to manage. Serena frowned slightly at Elise's brusque demeanor, but chose not to comment. Instead, she knelt to hug Miles tightly. "Have fun, sweetheart. Call me as soon as you land," she whispered. "I will," Miles promised, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. With one last wave, he turned toward the gate, clutching his backpack like a lifeline. The gate area was a flurry of activity, with passengers settling into seats and checking their phones. Miles found a spot by the window, where he could watch the planes taxiing on the tarmac. The sight filled him with awe. Each plane seemed alive, brimming with possibility. He imagined himself in the cockpit, guiding passengers safely through the clouds. "Flight 317 to Chicago is now boarding," came the announcement. Miles stood up, his small stature dwarfed by the adults around him as he joined the line. When he reached the gate agent, Elise was there again, her expression unchanged. "Boarding pass," she said tersely. Miles handed it over with a polite smile, but she barely glanced at him as she scanned it. "You'll sit near the back," she instructed. "Follow the aisle to your seat." "But I asked for a window seat," Miles said cautiously. His mother had specifically requested one for him, knowing how much he loved to watch the world from above. Elise's lips tightened. "Unaccompanied minors sit near the rear. It's policy," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. Without waiting for a response, she motioned for him to move along. Miles swallowed his disappointment and nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. He walked down the aisle, his excitement dimmed but not extinguished. Miles' seat was cramped and close to the lavatory, a far cry from the picturesque window seat he had envisioned. He tucked his backpack under the seat in front of him and buckled his seatbelt. The noise of passengers settling in surrounded him, but he tried to focus on the positives. He was on a plane. He was flying. That alone was magical. As he pulled out his father's aviator watch to check the time, an older man across the aisle noticed and leaned over with a kind smile. "That's a fine-looking watch you've got there," he said. Miles looked up, his face brightening. It was my dad's. He loved planes, and so do I. "Your dad must have been quite the man," the stranger said. "Name's Mr. Franklin. First time flying solo?" Miles nodded. "Yes, sir. I want to be a pilot someday, just like my dad." Mr. Franklin's smile widened. "Well, you're off to a good start. Keep those dreams alive, young man." Their conversation was interrupted by Elisa's arrival with a tray of drinks. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked briskly, her tone devoid of warmth. "Apple juice, please," Miles said politely. Elise poured the juice but set it down on his tray table with a loud clink, causing the liquid to spill slightly over the rim. "Be careful not to make a mess," she said sharply before moving on. Miles' cheeks flushed with embarrassment. He grabbed a napkin to clean up the spill, his hands trembling slightly. Mr. Franklin watched the interaction with a frown but said nothing, offering Miles an encouraging nod instead. As the plane took off, Miles pressed his face to the small, obstructed window beside him, trying to catch a glimpse of the world shrinking below. It was a moment he had dreamed about, but the cramped seat and harsh treatment from Elise made it less magical than he had imagined. Determined not to let it ruin his experience, he pulled out his sketchbook and began drawing. He lost himself in the details, carefully sketching the sleek lines of an airplane wing. Drawing always brought him comfort, a connection to his father and their shared passion for aviation. Elise appeared again, her sharp eyes narrowing as she noticed the open sketchbook. "This is an art class," she said coldly. "Make sure you don't get pencil marks on the seat." Miles looked up, startled. "I won't, Mom," he said quietly, closing the sketchbook and tucking it away. His enthusiasm was beginning to wane. The flight continued uneventfully for most passengers, but for Miles, each interaction with Elise chipped away at his excitement. Her curt remarks and dismissive attitude made him feel small and out of place. The warmth he had felt from Mr. Franklin and his mother's parting words were the only things keeping his spirits afloat. But as Miles sat quietly, holding his father's watch, a quiet solidarity began to build among the passengers around him. Mr. Franklin, the elderly woman in the row ahead, and even a young mother with a toddler noticed Elise's behavior. They exchanged glances, their disapproval growing with each passing interaction. Miles didn't notice their subtle support. He was focused on keeping his head up, just as his father had taught him. And though he didn't know it yet, the people around him were starting to see him for who he truly was, a young boy with a kind heart and dreams as vast as the sky. The turning point. The hum of the plane's engines settled into a steady rhythm as the aircraft leveled out at cruising altitude. Miles sat quietly in his cramped seat near the lavatory, his hands fidgeting with the lanyard around his neck. He tried to distract himself by sketching in his notebook, but the earlier encounters with Elise had left him feeling unwelcome and out of place. Nearby, Mr. Franklin observed the boy with quiet concern. The older man leaned toward the aisle, pretending to stretch, but really keeping an eye on Miles. He wasn't the only one. Several passengers had noticed Elise's dismissive attitude, and their quiet conversations hinted at a shared frustration. "Excuse me, young man," Mr. Franklin said softly, catching Miles' attention. "I couldn't help but notice your sketches earlier. Are those airplanes?" Miles looked up, his face lighting up slightly. "Yes, sir," he said, holding up his notebook. "I like drawing planes. My dad used to teach me all about them." Mr. Franklin smiled warmly. "You've got talent, son. Have you ever thought about becoming an aviation designer or even a pilot?" Miles' eyes sparkled with hope. "I want to be a pilot, like my dad. He used to say that flying is the closest we can get to freedom." The older man's heart swelled at the boy's earnestness. "Well, don't let anyone dim that dream. You've got the spirit for it. I can tell." Miles nodded, feeling a little more confident, but the moment was interrupted by the sound of Elise's sharp voice coming from a few rows ahead. "Excuse me, ma'am," Elise said, addressing an elderly woman struggling to retrieve her purse from under the seat in front of her. "You should have done this before takeoff. We don't have time to deal with this now." The woman hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm sorry, dear. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be. I just need my medication." Elise huffed impatiently, but before she could say anything else, Miles unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. He walked quickly down the aisle and knelt to retrieve the woman's purse. "Here you go, ma'am," he said with a polite smile, handing it to her. The elderly woman looked at him with gratitude. "Thank you, young man. You're very kind." Miles nodded and turned to head back to his seat, but Elise stepped in front of him, her arms crossed. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice low but stern. "You're supposed to stay in your seat. That's the rule." "I was just helping her," Miles replied softly, looking up at Elise with wide, earnest eyes. "That's not your job," Elise snapped. "You need to follow instructions and stay where you're told. Is that clear?" Miles nodded, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Yes, ma'am," he murmured, slipping back into his seat. The elderly woman, still clutching her purse, glared at Elise. "He was just being helpful," she said firmly. "You didn't have to speak to him like that." Elise didn't respond, instead turning on her heel and walking briskly toward the front of the cabin. Her behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. Several passengers exchanged glances, their disapproval evident. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin grew. Elise's interactions with Miles became increasingly curt, and her dismissive attitude grated on the passengers around him. Miles tried to keep to himself, focusing on his sketches and the view from the tiny window, but the weight of Elise's treatment hung over him like a storm cloud. At one point, a young mother seated a few rows ahead leaned over to her husband. "That flight attendant is out of line," she whispered. "The boy's done nothing wrong." Her husband nodded, his brow furrowed. "It's like she's singling him out for no reason. Someone should say something." A businessman seated across the aisle from Miles overheard the conversation and chimed in quietly. "I've been noticing it too. The kid's polite and well-behaved, but she's treating him like he's a problem." Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Grant Bennett and his co-pilot, Olivia Thompson, were discussing the flight's progress. Olivia, known for her approachable demeanor, decided to take a quick walk through the cabin to check on the passengers. It was a routine she enjoyed, as it allowed her to connect with the people she and Grant were flying. As she made her way down the aisle, Olivia noticed Miles sitting alone, clutching the small model plane in his hands. She paused and knelt beside his seat, her eyes soft with curiosity. "Hi there," she said warmly. "That's a great-looking model plane you've got." Miles looked up, startled by the friendly tone. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "It's just like the plane we're on. My dad gave it to me." Olivia's smile deepened. "Your dad must know a lot about planes." Miles nodded eagerly. He did. He was an aviation engineer. "I want to be a pilot like him someday." "That's a wonderful dream," Olivia said. "You know, every great pilot starts somewhere. And you're already off to a good start." Miles beamed at her words. For the first time since boarding, he felt truly seen and valued. As Olivia stood to continue her walk, she noticed Elise watching from the galley, her expression unreadable. Olivia gave her a brief nod, but Elise turned away, busying herself with rearranging items on the service cart. The cabin grew quieter as passengers settled in for the remainder of the flight, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Elise's behavior had left a sour taste in the mouths of many, and whispers of dissatisfaction began to ripple through the rows. "That poor boy," an elderly man murmured to his seatmate. "He's done nothing wrong, but she's treating him like a nuisance." "It's not right," the young mother added from her seat. "He's just a kid, and he's been so polite." Unbeknownst to Elise, the passengers were forming an unspoken alliance. They shared knowing glances and exchanged quiet words of support for Miles, their collective disapproval of Elise's actions growing stronger. As the flight neared its destination, Olivia returned to the cockpit and mentioned her encounter with Miles to Captain Bennett. "He's a bright kid," she said, "and he's been through a lot, losing his dad. But something's off. I noticed a lot of passengers looking upset, and I think it has to do with Elise." Grant frowned. "Elise has been with us for years. She's usually professional." "Maybe, but I've seen her snap at the boy a couple of times," Olivia replied. "It doesn't sit right with me. I think we should keep an eye on the situation." Grant nodded thoughtfully. "Thanks for letting me know. We'll address it if we need to." As the plane began its descent, the mood in the cabin shifted. The anticipation of landing brought a sense of urgency to the simmering discontent among the passengers. One by one, they made quiet plans to speak up once the flight was over. Miles, unaware of the growing support around him, stared out the window, his heart heavy. He thought about his father and the lessons he had taught him about perseverance and kindness. He touched the model plane in his lap, finding solace in its familiarity. "Stay strong," he whispered to himself. "Dad would want me to." Little did he know, the events that were about to unfold would change the course of the flight, and Elise's perspective, forever. The ripple effect. The plane began its gradual descent, the engine hum shifting as the captain's voice echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in approximately 30 minutes. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Thank you for flying with us." Miles gazed out the small, smudged window, watching the clouds part to reveal the sprawling patchwork of land below. Despite the breathtaking view, his heart felt heavy. His first solo flight, something he had anticipated for months, had been marred by Elise's cold demeanor and cutting remarks. He clutched the model plane his father had given him, the only comfort in an otherwise challenging journey. Across the aisle, Mr. Franklin shifted in his seat, observing Miles with quiet empathy. The boy's resilience reminded him of his own grandson, who had faced struggles with bullying at school. Determined to help, Mr. Franklin leaned forward slightly, catching Miles' attention. "Son," he said softly, his voice warm and steady, "do you know what the most important thing a pilot does in turbulence is?" Miles turned toward him, his curiosity piqued. "What's that, sir?" Mr. Franklin smiled knowingly. "They stay calm. No matter how rough it gets, they hold the controls steady. That's what you're doing right now, and it's admirable." Miles blinked, processing the older man's words. He nodded slowly, a flicker of determination returning to his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Meanwhile, in the galley, Elise busied herself with organizing the service trays, her movements sharp and methodical. She prided herself on running an efficient cabin, but a small knot of discomfort had formed in her chest. The occasional whispers from passengers, coupled with the disapproving looks she'd caught, hinted at their dissatisfaction. Still, she brushed it off. "These people don't understand how hard this job is," she muttered under her breath, stacking cups with unnecessary force. From the other end of the galley, her colleague Marissa, a younger and more approachable flight attendant, approached with a cautious smile. "Hey, Elise," Marissa said hesitantly, "I couldn't help but notice. There's been some tension in the cabin. Is everything okay?" Elise stiffened, her lips thinning. "Everything's fine. Just a kid who thinks the rules don't apply to him." Marissa frowned slightly. "That boy, Miles, he's been nothing but polite. I saw him helping that elderly passenger earlier. Honestly, he seems like a sweet kid." Elise waved her off. "Sweet or not, rules are rules. He needs to learn discipline." Marissa hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, deciding not to push further. But her expression carried doubt, and she silently resolved to keep an eye on the situation. A quiet rebellion. As the plane descended further, passengers began to stir. The businessman seated near Miles tapped his fingers on his tray table, his mind racing with thoughts about the unfairness he had witnessed. The young mother whispered to her husband, her tone resolute. Even the elderly woman Miles had helped earlier sat straighter in her seat, her eyes narrowing with quiet determination. Mr. Franklin, sensing the collective unease, leaned across the aisle and whispered to the businessman, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" The businessman nodded. "Someone needs to say something. This flight attendant's behavior is unacceptable." The two exchanged knowing glances before turning their attention to the passengers around them. Subtly, they began to coordinate a plan, their voices hushed but purposeful. One by one, others joined the quiet rebellion, nodding in agreement and preparing to take a stand. The unexpected announcement. In the cockpit, Captain Bennett monitored the instruments as Olivia returned from her final walkthrough of the cabin. She settled into her seat, her expression thoughtful. "Something on your mind?" Bennett asked, glancing at her briefly. Olivia hesitated, then spoke. "It's that boy in the back. Miles. He's been nothing but respectful, but Elise has been riding him hard the entire flight. I think the passengers are noticing too." Bennett frowned, his grip on the controls tightening slightly. Elise has always been strict, but this sounds like more than that. Olivia nodded. "I think it's worth addressing once we land. It's not just about the boy. It's about the environment she's creating for everyone on board." Bennett sighed, his mind already racing with how to handle the situation diplomatically. "I trust your instincts, Olivia. We'll deal with it." The final interaction. As the plane prepared for its final approach, Elise made her way down the aisle, conducting a last-minute check. When she reached Miles' row, her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. "Tray table up," she said curtly, her tone sharper than it needed to be. Miles hurried to comply, fumbling slightly in his nervousness. The model plane slipped from his lap, clattering to the floor. He bent down to retrieve it, but Elise's sigh of exasperation stopped him. "Leave it," she said impatiently. "We're landing. Stay seated." Miles froze, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. He sank back into his seat, his hands clenching into fists on his lap. The noise had drawn the attention of nearby passengers, who exchanged looks of disapproval. Mr. Franklin couldn't stay silent any longer. He unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Miss, that boy has done nothing wrong. Perhaps you should reconsider how you're addressing him." Elise straightened, her eyes narrowing. "Sir, I suggest you remain seated and let me do my job." Before Mr. Franklin could respond, the young mother 2 rows ahead turned around. "Your job should include treating passengers with respect," she said, her voice steady but laced with irritation. A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. The businessman raised his hand, addressing Elise directly. "We've all been watching. The way you've spoken to that child is unacceptable." Elise's composure faltered for a moment, her eyes darting around the cabin as more passengers joined in. The elderly woman Miles had helped earlier chimed in, her voice firm. "That boy showed more kindness in 2 minutes than you have this entire flight." The collective voices grew louder, their unified message unmistakable. Elise's cheeks flushed, and she took a small step back, suddenly feeling the weight of their disapproval. A lesson in humility. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Elise avoided eye contact with the passengers, her normally rigid posture slightly slumped. For the first time, she felt the sting of her actions reflected back at her. When the seatbelt sign turned off, Captain Bennett and Olivia stepped into the cabin. The murmurs of discontent reached their ears immediately. Olivia approached Elise, her expression neutral but her tone firm. "Elise, may I have a word?" Elise nodded stiffly, following Olivia to the galley. There, Olivia spoke plainly. "We've received several complaints about your behavior toward a young passenger. This is not the standard of service we uphold." Elise opened her mouth to defend herself but stopped, realizing she had no justification. The disapproving faces of the passengers replayed in her mind, and for the first time, she felt a pang of regret. Back in the cabin, Miles stood to gather his belongings. Mr. Franklin patted him on the shoulder. "You did well, son," he said warmly. "Remember, even when it's tough, staying true to yourself matters." Miles smiled faintly, his heart a little lighter. The quiet support of the passengers had given him a renewed sense of strength. The apology. As passengers began to disembark, Elise approached Miles hesitantly. Her usual confidence was replaced with an awkward stiffness. "Miles," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "I want to apologize. I was unfair to you, and that was wrong." Miles looked up at her, his expression a mix of surprise and hesitation. "It's okay," he said softly, his tone sincere but guarded. Elise nodded, unable to meet his gaze for long. She stepped aside, allowing him to exit the plane with the other passengers. The ripple effect of her actions, both good and bad, stayed with her as she watched them go. For Miles, the journey wasn't perfect, but it became a powerful lesson in resilience and the unexpected kindness of strangers, a lesson he would carry with him as he continued to chase his dreams of touching the skies. Redemption in the sky. The hum of the engines softened as passengers began gathering their belongings. Flight attendants prepared for the deboarding process, offering polite smiles as they moved through the aisle. Miles sat quietly, watching other passengers shuffle around him. The weight of the day pressed on his small shoulders, but a lingering warmth from the unexpected support he'd received from strangers gave him a glimmer of hope. He looked down at the model plane in his hands. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "The sky isn't just a place for planes, Miles. It's a place for freedom, for perspective. Up there, everything seems small, except for what truly matters." Miles took a deep breath, repeating those words in his mind. The flight had been turbulent in ways he hadn't expected, but his resolve had remained steady. An unexpected request. As the plane came to a stop at the gate and the passengers prepared to disembark, Captain Bennett stepped out of the cockpit, his tall, commanding presence drawing attention. His sharp, professional gaze softened when it landed on Miles. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bennett's voice carried easily through the cabin, "I'd like to make a special announcement before you disembark. We have a future aviator on board today." Passengers turned, their curiosity piqued, as Bennett made his way toward Miles. The boy looked up, startled to find himself the center of attention. "Miles Carter," Bennett said with a smile. "I hear you've been holding your own on your first solo flight. Would you like to join me in the cockpit before you leave? I'd love to show you the controls." Gasps of delight rippled through the cabin, followed by a smattering of applause. Miles' eyes widened as he nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. I'd love to." Bennett motioned for him to follow. As Miles stood, several passengers cheered him on. "Go get him, buddy," Mr. Franklin said, giving him an encouraging thumbs up. The elderly woman Miles had helped earlier dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her smile radiating pride. Even Elise, standing near the galley, watched with a mixture of astonishment and unease. She felt a strange tug of regret as she saw the boy's face light up with joy. The applause wasn't just for a child. It was for his resilience and his kindness, a quiet rebuke to her own behavior. The heart of the plane. Inside the cockpit, Miles' awe was immediate. Buttons, levers, and screens surrounded him, each one brimming with possibility. The soft glow of instruments illuminated the space like something out of a dream. Captain Bennett and Olivia stood nearby, watching with amusement as Miles took it all in. "This," Bennett said, gesturing around him, "is where the magic happens. You see this yoke? That's how we steer the plane. And these instruments tell us everything we need to know: our altitude, speed, direction." Miles reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing the yoke. He could feel the faint vibration of the plane's systems through the controls, and it sent a thrill down his spine. "This is amazing," he whispered. Olivia crouched beside him, her voice kind. "Someday, you'll be sitting here for real, Miles. I can tell you've got the passion and the heart for it." Miles turned to her, his expression resolute. "I will. I promise." Elise's turning point. From the galley, Elise peeked toward the cockpit, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She'd spent the flight dismissing Miles, brushing off his politeness and enthusiasm as mere nuisances. But now, seeing him in the cockpit, surrounded by the warmth of the crew and passengers alike, she felt the full weight of her actions. Marissa approached her cautiously, handing her a clipboard. "You okay?" she asked softly. Elise nodded stiffly, but said nothing. Her gaze lingered on Miles, who was now asking Bennett thoughtful questions about the flight controls. The boy's sincerity and resilience stirred something deep within her, a reminder of why she'd become a flight attendant in the first place. It wasn't just about efficiency or rules. It was about people. Somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten that. A collective voice. As Miles returned from the cockpit, his cheeks flushed with excitement. The passengers were still waiting, their expressions filled with anticipation. Elise watched, unsure of what to expect, as Mr. Franklin stood and cleared his throat. "I think I speak for everyone here," the older man began, his voice steady and loud enough to carry through the cabin, "when I say this young man has shown remarkable courage today. He's handled challenges with grace and kindness, something we can all learn from." The cabin erupted into applause, passengers nodding in agreement. The businessman chimed in, his voice firm. "And I also think we need to acknowledge that he's been treated unfairly. It's not right, and we should speak up about it." Elise's face flushed. She took a deep breath, stepping forward to address the group. Her voice, usually so sharp, was uncharacteristically soft. "You're right," she admitted. "I haven't been fair to Miles, or to any of you. I let my own frustrations cloud my judgment. And for that, I'm truly sorry." The cabin fell silent for a moment. Then, to Elise's surprise, the elderly woman spoke up. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. Thank you for apologizing." A moment of connection. As the passengers disembarked, many stopped to speak to Miles. They offered kind words, pats on the back, and encouragement for his dream of becoming a pilot. Miles, overwhelmed but grateful, thanked each of them, his confidence slowly rebuilding. When Elise finally approached him, she knelt to his level, her expression sincere. "Miles," she began, "I owe you a personal apology. I didn't treat you the way you deserved, and I regret that deeply. You've shown more maturity and kindness today than I did. Thank you for reminding me what really matters." Miles studied her face for a moment, then smiled shyly. "It's okay, ma'am. Everyone makes mistakes." Elise blinked back unexpected tears, moved by the boy's generosity of spirit. "Thank you, Miles," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I hope one day, when you're a pilot, you'll remember this moment, not because of me, but because of the support you inspired from everyone here." The sky beckons. As Miles stepped off the plane, the terminal seemed brighter, the buzz of travelers more harmonious. He spotted his grandmother waiting near the gate, her face lighting up as she saw him. He ran into her arms, his heart swelling with love and relief. "Grandma," he said excitedly, holding up his model plane. "I got to see the cockpit. Captain Bennett showed me everything." She laughed, brushing his curls back from his face. "Oh, Miles, that sounds wonderful. Your dad would be so proud." Miles nodded, his smile unwavering. "I think he'd say I'm ready for my next flight." As they walked through the terminal, Miles glanced back at the gate one last time. Elise stood in the doorway, watching him with a small, thoughtful smile. She gave him a wave, and he returned it, feeling a newfound sense of closure. The flight had been far from perfect, but it had taught Miles, and everyone involved, an invaluable lesson. The sky wasn't just a place for planes. It was a place for connection, growth, and understanding. And as Miles looked forward to his next adventure, he knew his dreams had taken flight in more ways than one. Strength in the journey. Miles and his grandmother left the bustling terminal, stepping into the warm glow of the afternoon sun. The excitement of the flight lingered in Miles' chest, but so did the echoes of Elise's initial harshness. Yet the support of the passengers, Captain Bennett, and Olivia had taught him an important lesson. Even in moments of adversity, kindness could light the way. "Your father would have loved to hear about today," his grandmother said, her voice soft with pride as they walked toward the car. "He always said the best pilots are the ones who stay calm under pressure." Miles nodded, clutching the model plane in his hand. "I tried to stay calm, Grandma, even when it was hard." "And you did," she replied, ruffling his hair. "I think you'll make an incredible pilot one day." As they drove to her home, Miles gazed out the window, his mind replaying the events of the day. He thought about the passengers who had stood up for him, about Captain Bennett's encouragement, and about Elise's eventual apology. Each moment felt like a thread in a larger story, one that was shaping him into the person he aspired to be. Back on the plane, while Miles was settling in at his grandmother's house, Elise sat in the now empty cabin, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The passengers had all disembarked, leaving behind a lingering silence. For the first time in years, she felt small in the space where she usually commanded authority. Captain Bennett approached, his footsteps measured and deliberate. He stopped beside Elise, crossing his arms as he studied her. "You want to tell me what happened today?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Elise sighed, avoiding his gaze. "I don't know, Captain. I just lost my patience." The boy was polite, but I kept seeing him as an inconvenience. "An inconvenience," Bennett repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Elise, that boy handled more adversity today than some adults ever do. And instead of supporting him, you made things harder." "Why?" Elise shook her head, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know. Maybe I've been doing this job too long. Maybe I've forgotten why I started." Bennett softened slightly, sensing her inner conflict. "You've been one of our best attendants for years, Elise, but today you let your frustration cloud your judgment. The passengers saw it. The crew saw it. And that boy, he felt it." Elise winced, her shoulders slumping. "I know. I saw it in his eyes. He didn't deserve that." "No, he didn't," Bennett agreed. "But here's the thing. It's not too late to make it right. You apologized to him, and that's a good start. But if you want to continue in this role, you need to find that part of yourself that cares about people, the part that got buried under all the routine." Elise nodded slowly, her chest tightening with guilt. "You're right. I need to be better. An unlikely ally." As the cabin crew wrapped up their post-flight duties, Olivia approached Elise, her expression kinder than before. "Hey," she said softly. "You okay?" Elise managed a weak smile. "I'll be fine. I let that boy down today." Olivia placed a hand on her shoulder. "Maybe. But you also admitted it and apologized. That takes courage." Elise looked at her, surprised. "You really think so?" "I do," Olivia said firmly. "And you know what? That boy will remember the apology just as much as the mistakes. It's not about being perfect, it's about being human." For the first time that day, Elise felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't beyond redemption. She could learn from this, grow from it, and maybe even become the kind of flight attendant she had once aspired to be. Miles' new beginning. At his grandmother's house, Miles settled into the cozy guest room. The walls were lined with framed photos of his father, laughing at a barbecue, fixing an old plane engine, and standing proudly in front of a Cessna. Each picture was a reminder of the legacy Miles hoped to honor. He unpacked his backpack, carefully setting the model plane on the nightstand. Beside it, he placed his father's aviator watch and his sketchbook, flipping through the pages of detailed airplane drawings. He paused on a half-finished sketch and picked up a pencil, letting his imagination take flight. As he sketched, his grandmother entered the room with a tray of cookies and milk. "You've had quite the day," she said with a smile, setting the tray down on the desk. "Do you want to talk about it?" Miles hesitated, then nodded. "It was hard, Grandma. The flight attendant, Elise, she didn't like me. She made me feel like I didn't belong." His grandmother's eyes softened with understanding. Sometimes people carry their own struggles, and they don't know how to handle them. But you know what's important. You didn't let it stop you. And you inspired the people around you to stand up for what's right. Miles considered her words, a small smile forming on his lips. I guess I did. You did, she affirmed. And that's something your dad would be so proud of. A letter of gratitude. The next morning, Miles sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper in front of him. His grandmother had suggested he write a letter to Captain Bennett, thanking him for his kindness and encouragement. Dear Captain Bennett, thank you for letting me see the cockpit and for telling me I'm part of the team. It made me feel special, like I really can be a pilot someday. I'll always remember what you said about staying calm during turbulence. I also want to thank Olivia. She was so nice to me, and she made me feel like I belong. And to the passengers who stood up for me, I'll never forget their kindness. This flight taught me a lot, not just about planes but about people. I hope someday I can inspire others the way you inspired me. Sincerely, Miles Carter. As he folded the letter, Miles felt a sense of closure. The flight hadn't been perfect, but it had given him something invaluable. Resilience, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. Elise's path to redemption. Back at the airport, Elise sat in the break room, staring at her reflection in the small mirror on the wall. She thought about Miles, about his quiet courage, and the way he had accepted her apology with grace. It humbled her. Determined to change, Elise decided to attend a workshop on empathy and conflict resolution offered by the airline. She also reached out to Captain Bennett, asking for advice on how to reconnect with the joy of her job. Her first step, however, was writing her own letter to Miles. Dear Miles, I want to thank you for your kindness and patience during our flight. You taught me an important lesson about strength and grace, even when things are difficult. I'm sorry for the way I treated you. It wasn't right, and I hope you'll forgive me. You have a bright future ahead of you, and I know you'll make an amazing pilot someday. Thank you for reminding me why I chose this career in the first place. Wishing you all the best. Elise. As she sealed the envelope, Elise felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had taken a step toward becoming better, inspired by a boy who had every reason to be bitter, but chose kindness instead. Looking ahead, for both Miles and Elise, the flight had been a turning point. It wasn't just about the journey through the sky. It was about finding strength in adversity, learning from mistakes, and embracing the connections that define us. As Miles prepared for his next adventure, and Elise began her journey of personal growth, both knew one thing for certain. The sky was vast, full of possibilities, and always waiting to teach those brave enough to fly. A shared horizon. The morning light spilled into Miles' room at his grandmother's house, illuminating the model plane and sketchbook on his desk. He stirred awake, the memories of the previous day lingering like vivid dreams. Though the flight had its challenges, the moments of kindness and support he'd experienced filled him with a newfound determination. As Miles got ready for the day, his grandmother's voice called from the kitchen. Miles, you've got mail. Curious, he hurried downstairs. On the table sat an envelope with the airline's logo stamped on the corner. His grandmother handed it to him with a knowing smile. Looks like someone wanted to reach out to you. Miles carefully opened the envelope, pulling out a neatly folded letter. His heart raced as he began to read. Dear Miles, I want to thank you for the courage, grace, and kindness you displayed during our flight. I didn't handle things as I should have, and I owe you an apology. You reminded me of the importance of treating others with respect and understanding, and for that, I'm deeply grateful. You showed maturity beyond your years, and I have no doubt you'll achieve your dream of becoming a pilot. Your resilience is inspiring, and I'll carry the lessons I learned from you into every flight I take from now on. Thank you for being the amazing young man you are. I hope our paths cross again someday. Sincerely, Elise Hawthorne. Miles read the letter twice, his emotions a mix of surprise and relief. Elise's words carried a weight he hadn't expected, and though the wounds of her earlier behavior lingered, her apology felt genuine. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his sketchbook, deciding to keep it as a reminder of the lessons they had both learned. A community response. While Miles reflected on Elise's letter, a ripple effect was unfolding elsewhere. The passengers from the flight, still moved by what they had witnessed, began sharing their experiences online. A young mother posted on a parenting forum about how a brave boy had inspired a group of strangers to stand together. The elderly woman Miles had helped share her story with her local newspaper, emphasizing the importance of kindness, especially in challenging situations. The businessman, who had remained stoic throughout most of the flight, drafted a detailed letter to the airline, commending the boy's resilience and calling for better training in empathy for staff. "It's not about punishment," he wrote. "It's about ensuring every passenger, especially children, feels valued." Within days, the story began gaining traction. Social media posts poured in, celebrating Miles as a symbol of resilience and kindness. The airline, now aware of the situation, issued a statement acknowledging the incident and promising steps to improve their services. They also announced a plan to create a special program for young aviation enthusiasts, inspired by Miles' story, a visit to the airfield. Later that week, Miles' grandmother surprised him with a visit to the local airfield. It was a small, privately owned strip where aspiring pilots trained, and Miles' eyes widened as they pulled into the gravel parking lot. The roar of engines and the sight of planes taking off sent a thrill through him. "I thought you might like this," his grandmother said with a smile. "There's someone here who wants to meet you." As they stepped out of the car, a familiar figure emerged from one of the hangars. Captain Bennett, still in his crisp uniform, waved at them with a grin. "Miles, good to see you again." Miles ran up to him, his excitement bubbling over. "Captain Bennett, what are you doing here?" Bennett chuckled. "I heard about this place and thought it'd be the perfect spot to give you a proper introduction to the world of aviation." He led Miles toward a small plane parked on the tarmac. It gleamed in the sunlight, its sleek body a marvel of engineering. "This," Bennett said, patting the plane's side, "is a Piper Cherokee, perfect for training new pilots." Miles stared at the plane in awe. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Would you like to sit in the cockpit?" Bennett asked. Miles nodded vigorously, and within moments he was seated in the pilot's seat. The controls felt familiar, yet thrillingly new. Bennett climbed in beside him, pointing out each instrument and explaining its purpose. Miles absorbed every word, his dreams feeling more tangible with each passing moment. A lesson in flight. After an hour of learning about the plane's systems and controls, Bennett surprised Miles with an offer. "How about we take her up for a short flight?" Miles' eyes widened. "Really? I can come with you." Bennett grinned. "Of course. You'll be my co-pilot." With his grandmother's enthusiastic approval, Miles strapped into the seat beside Bennett. The hum of the engine vibrated through his chest as the plane began to taxi down the runway. When they took off, Miles felt a familiar rush, the same one he'd felt on his solo flight, but now magnified by the thrill of being part of the process. As they soared through the sky, Bennett handed Miles the yoke. "Your turn," he said, guiding him gently. "Hold it steady." Miles gripped the controls, his heart racing with exhilaration. For a few glorious moments, he felt the true freedom his father had always spoken of. The world below seemed small, but his dreams felt enormous. Elise's new approach. Meanwhile, back at the airline, Elise was working on rebuilding her confidence and compassion. Inspired by the passengers' feedback and her conversation with Bennett, she volunteered to mentor new flight attendants, sharing the lessons she'd learned about empathy and resilience. In one of her workshops, Elise shared Miles' story, using it as an example of how small actions could make a big difference, for better or worse. Her colleagues listened intently, many of them moved by her vulnerability and commitment to change. A full circle. Months later, Miles received another letter. this time from the airline. Inside was an invitation to a special event honoring his resilience and the positive impact he had made. The event, held at the airline's headquarters, included a tour of their facilities and a ceremony recognizing him as an honorary junior aviator. Miles attended the event with his grandmother, and to his surprise, Elise was there. She greeted him warmly, her demeanor completely transformed. "Miles," she said, her voice steady and genuine, "I've learned so much because of you. Thank you for being the person you are." Miles smiled, offering her a handshake. "Thank you for your letter," he replied. "It meant a lot." As the ceremony concluded, Captain Bennett presented Miles with a custom set of wings engraved with his name. "These are just the beginning," Bennett said. "One day, I expect to see you flying the big planes." The audience erupted into applause, and Miles stood taller, the wings pinned proudly to his jacket. In that moment, he realized that the journey wasn't just about reaching the skies. It was about the people who helped him get there. The endless horizon. As the years passed, Miles continued to chase his dream of becoming a pilot. He carried with him the lessons of that pivotal flight, the kindness of strangers, and the support of those who believed in him. And when he eventually took his place in the cockpit of his first commercial flight, he looked out at the horizon and smiled, knowing that his journey had only just begun. The sky was vast, full of possibilities, and Miles was ready to explore every inch of it. The endless horizon. The ceremony at the airline headquarters was the kind of moment Miles would remember for the rest of his life. As the applause died down, Captain Bennett leaned down to whisper, "Always keep these wings close, Miles. They're more than a pin. They're a reminder of what you've already accomplished and what you'll achieve." Miles nodded, his small hand brushing over the engraved wings on his jacket. "Thank you, Captain. I won't let you down." Bennett smiled. "I never thought you would." As the event concluded, Miles had one last surprise waiting for him. Elise, standing near the exit, motioned for him and his grandmother to approach. In her hands was a framed photograph of a plane soaring through the clouds, with a note taped to the back. "This is for you, Miles," she said softly. "I thought it might inspire you to keep reaching for the skies. And it's my way of saying thank you for reminding me why I chose this career. You've made me better." Miles accepted the gift with a shy smile. "Thank you, Miss Hawthorne." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "Call me Elise. A dream takes flight." Back at his grandmother's house, Miles placed the framed photograph on his nightstand beside his model plane and his father's aviator watch. He flipped over the note on the back of the picture, which read, "To Miles, the sky is vast, and so is your potential. Never forget the impact you've already made, and always keep dreaming big. Elise." Those words stayed with him as he grew, fueling his passion for aviation and his commitment to kindness. In the following years, Miles dedicated himself to learning everything he could about flying. He spent hours sketching planes, poring over books, and even volunteering at the local airfield. With Captain Bennett's mentorship and his grandmother's unwavering support, Miles took his first official flying lesson at age 16. By 18, he had earned his private pilot's license. Through every challenge, Miles carried the lessons of his first solo flight, the importance of staying calm in turbulence, the power of kindness, and the strength to persevere. A new captain in the sky. Years later, Miles stood in the cockpit of a commercial airliner, dressed in his own crisp uniform. The airline logo shone on his lapel, and a pair of wings, his wings, sat proudly on his chest. His first official flight as Captain Miles Carter was about to begin. As the crew prepared for takeoff, Miles reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of his father, whose passion for aviation had sparked his dreams. He thought of his grandmother, whose steadfast encouragement had been his anchor. And he thought of the passengers and crew on that long-ago flight, who had shown him the importance of standing up for what's right. Above all, he thought of the boy he used to be, the boy who had faced adversity with courage and grace, and who had inspired a ripple effect of kindness that continued to shape the lives of others. As the plane lifted off the ground, Miles looked out at the horizon, his heart swelling with gratitude. The sky stretched endlessly before him, a canvas of possibility and promise. This was his dream, and he was living it.